Okay, it's always good to be punctual. It's 17:30. Great to see so many faces. Welcome to the outreach event of EuroStrings 2025 and the yearly meeting of the cost action. I will make it very short, but I just want to tell you what to expect. We start with 3 presentations of differing length. It will be, you'll notice how long they are, but they will be all really interesting. We start with the presentation on the topic, well, the general topic of this meeting here is the role of science in times of geopolitical uncertainty. That's a mouthful, but yeah, so I think it has not been tried before as an outreach event, and we're really looking forward to see what kind of feedback this gets. But so we start with some words on this topic by the director of NORDITA, Mikael Vogelstam. Then very honored to have the director of cost, big action that makes this in part all possible, together with NORDITA and many other funders, Ronald Bruin, who flew in especially for this event. And then Robbert Dijkgraaf, I kind of dare to say our own Robbert Dijkgraaf, will give a presentation. We all know Robbert. In fact, I thought it was very interesting that during the first talk yesterday, the Dijkgraaf, of course, now I'm saying because there's so many things after, but I highlight one, the Dijkgraaf-Witten model was invoked. And like that, I could go on, but I will not. But I will say that Robbert has a big track record in fundamental science and science policy, having been director of the IES, having been president of the Royal Society for Arts and Sciences in Holland, having been the Minister for Science, Education and Culture in Holland from 2022 to 2024, and recently being president-elect of ISC. And also, and I find that particularly very fitting with the topic of today, since the 1st of April, university professor at the University of Amsterdam in a special chair of science and society and their relation to international affairs. This is very fitting. Simultaneously, Robbert is also a professor of mathematical physics. But after this introduction, I'll give the word to Mikael Vogelstam, director of NORDITA. I can do this. Yeah. And then I can also meanwhile say that after these presentations, as you can maybe already guess, with the 3 chairs there will be what's meant to be a lively panel debate. So when questions come up during these presentations, please remember them or write them down, and you'll get the chance to ask them and see reactions of the panel. Please.
Thank you, Niels. So I'm very happy to welcome you all to Stockholm and NORDITA Alba Nova University Center for this outreach event. And it's part of an ongoing, rather large, reoccurring series of conferences called EuroStrings. Given the topic of this evening event, I think NORDITA, with its history, is actually a very suitable host and a suitable venue to host this talks and the discussion to come. I'll try to motivate this, and it's sort of a historical looking back, and NORDITA's first director was actually Niels Bohr. And I imagine with his personality, I never met him, I'm too young for that, but you read about and you get the feeling of a quite big personality with very nice personal traits. And I think NORDITA has carried on, or is built very much on the spirit. And his deeds, in a sense, I feel very important. We all know that he was sort of the father there are many fathers, of course, but to modern physics, and particularly bringing a lot of bright young scientists to Copenhagen to forge and discuss new quantum mechanics and lay the foundations of what to come. Interacting, of course, with the bright minds of the time. And this was an activity, so if you go to the lecture halls in Copenhagen, you see all these nice photographs, and it's basically every big name of the time were there and they were interacting. And it must have been a very fruitful environment because many of the attendees actually had to go to Stockholm in December. So I think this is a very important part in scientific collaboration, to be able to explore and build new things. And of course, a conference like this is an essential part of that. NORDITA itself is sort of a post-World War II child. And of course, we know pre-World War II, there was a large brain drain for the wrong reasons from Europe. And building an institute like NORDITA is, of course, to get a brain gain and stop and reverse the flow. And it was also very important at that time to secure knowledge and expertise in the new field of atomic physics. And NORDITA is actually an abbreviation, so it's the Nordic Institute for Theoretical Atomic Physics. But it's turned very quickly over to theoretical physics. And the hearsay is that they even made a bid to be the CERN part of theory department at the point, but they failed. It was put in Switzerland on the border to France. That's fine. And of course, together with politicians, Niels Bohr was a champion for this because he was very much for open science and not keeping secrets, because secrets become dangerous in this field. And that was very typical for the weapons that came out of atomic physics. And there are also peaceful means, and in Sweden, there was a very big drive for nuclear power at that time, which was in its early stages. But that initiated, and there's a good track record. So we brag always with NORDITA actually placing, like, I think it's 132, but I guess the numbers should be changed, professors in the Nordic countries. So it has been really working well when it's been attracting with the brain gain, I would say, and also with education and profilation of science in our community. After that, when NORDITA moved on, it also took another role, and sort of the topic of today is when we are in troubled times and how should we act. And in half a century ago, we had the Cold War and we had an Iron Curtain, and there were very little exchange between scientists. But a place like NORDITA in a small country, Denmark was part of NATO, but considered more or less neutral. This is a place where scientists from the East and the West Bloc could meet and exchange ideas and understand what was going on in either places. And for peace and development of everything, this is crucial. Here, science is so important that we have a good understanding of what is going on in our different countries, in our different labs. And it also a joint development. It's quite interesting if you're a little bit into history of science. There are many parallel developments that went on in these locked countries. And there are many famous mesoscopic physicists who in Europe discovered things, and they found out that that was published a long time ago in somewhere in Russia that time. So that is how it was. But when you meet, then you can start exploring and building knowledge together. And I think that's extremely important, perhaps not for countries, but for mankind. Well, the Cold War ended, the Iron Curtain fell, and we went into a long spell of disarmament and so peace. And we have actually been in that phase for such a long time that we think that is normal. But if you think about history, that is actually not normal. It's actually an anomaly that you can spend such long time in peace. Given Europe, we We're good at many things, but we have been very good at fighting each other. But now we have had a long time of peace. And this means also that we sort of forget sometimes what is important, because we get it for free. And now I would say there are multifaceted dark clouds on the international arena. And I think we'll get some input on that in the talks to come. And I think it's important to look back and perhaps reinvent and get inspired to work together again, and within this kind of institutes like NORDITA is, and there are others in the world. With this, I would like to welcome you to this open event of EuroStrings from the behalf of NORDITA. Thank you.
Not. Then it's my great pleasure to give the floor to Ronald Bruin, Director of Cost.
Thank you so much. Good evening. Good evening. Oh, it's not bedtime yet. It's a pleasure to be here. What I would like to offer you as a contribution to the debate is some practical examples on how politics, or geopolitics, if you like, influences, let's say, a funding agency like cost. And before doing that, of course, I have to explain a little bit about cost, what cost is. Is there anyone here who has ever participated in a cost program, cost networks? That feels very good. That feels very good. Okay. Now, for those of you who are not so much aware about cost, it was more or less incubated when I was incubated as a human being. I'm of a cohort 1969. Cost was given birth at the occasion of 1971. And the purpose has always remained the same. The idea is to create networks, bottom-up, excellence-driven, inclusive, in order to tackle European-wide challenges. That basically has been the mission since the very beginning. Now, over time, we have found ourselves in a position to also give more support, more empowerment, not just funding, support, and even training to build capacity across, let's say, the networks that we have. Now, we do this, let's say, on a European scale or a pan-European scale. We have excellence, of course, as one of our key values. We promote very much interdisciplinarity. When disciplines come together, you get breakthroughs. The idea is that, of course, breakthroughs will lead ultimately to innovation. Just before the lecture here, we had, I think, a good discussion about the challenges to shift from research to actual innovation and impact. And last but not least, the empowerment of young researchers and to retain young researchers in Europe. So those are our, let's say, more recent strategic goals. The European map of cost, and here you see a color-coded map. These are all the members. We have 41. We also have South Africa as a partner member. They are not part of our, let's say, normal constituency, but they put some money aside to also facilitate their researchers to join the cost networks. We have Israel as a cooperating member. No voting rights, but in the end, all the benefits of the cost program are equally applicable. Now, I say color-coded map because we have a specific policy to promote inclusiveness, and that means that we want to include also less research-intensive countries. So those are colored in green, whereas the other ones are colored in purple. Looking at the bigger map, and I think this is as big as the map can be, at least on this planet, we see the membership of cost in purple, and then a green, let's say, ring around cost. We call them the near neighbor countries. I will give you a specific case on what happened as a consequence of the geopolitical shifts. And then we have the rest of the world in quotation mark in orange. It basically means that if you are a participant from an institute in, let's say, a European country or in one of those green countries, you can participate and receive funding. You get your travel, you know, and overnight stays and so forth reimbursed. The rest of the world can also participate, but they have to bear their own expenditure. So COST is truly open to the world. And I would have to immediately add that part of the mission of COST is also to focus on peaceful purposes only. Now, that said, as a, let's say, an intro, to make it concrete, how does it work? Of course, it works with an excellent idea from a researcher, in this case, a Portuguese one, that rallies around the flag and make sure that there are some mates to act as a secondary proposer to join in submitting a proposal to our open call. So far, so good. This is what normally happens. The distinction with COST is that this is not necessarily the group that is going to do it. The group is going to be larger. And so we say that if you submit an excellent proposal, we help you to build a network around it. We have national contact points in all the countries that are member of COST. And so we are asking those people to nominate researchers from their communities to join the COST action where they've never been in the proposal in the first place, but they can get funded. So that's how you start building a network, let's say, by creating the right framework conditions for bottom-up, let's say, initiatives to prosper. So this is how it works. Just a few numbers. We have around 300 of those networks. In total, we have around 60,000 active participants in those networks. What they typically do, apart from organizing conferences, is short-term mobility. So this is at the individual participant level, but they also organize training schools, for example. An estimated budget, it's an annual budget of roughly 170,000. And then you say, hey, if you do the mathematics, 60,000 divided by 300, roughly 200 per network on average. So there's not a lot of money. And that is exactly because we do not fund research. We fund the networking. So we fund the travels, the training schools and so forth. We assume that the participants are involved in their own projects, whether at national level or European level, and then come together, exchange in a peer network, and then move on from there. Our own total budget for the last 5 years has been roughly 270 million, and we get a bit of money for the remainder of this framework program from the European Commission. So that's very practical. Now, what I sometimes do is to give a talk about cost and the benefits and go into much more detail than I've just done a moment ago. This is an example of a conference that was organized in Cairo in February this year. And we used that occasion to, at the same time, invite people from countries that are in the Northern African green zone, so to speak, of course. So they are our neighbor countries. And on the top, you see a picture of this meeting with people from Egypt, Azerbaijan, Jordan, Morocco, Libya even, Palestine, and who else is that? That must be Algeria. Yes, Algeria was there. And an attaché from the European Commission who was stationed in Addis Ababa. And there you can truly see that there is more than just going to training schools. There are people in those parts of the world that do have talent, but have no clue how to get into a European program. And because they do not even have to submit a proposal to join, for them this is the first step, the way in. To join a peer network and to submit proposals, maybe with some people they meet, or to publish with people that they meet, and so forth. They are able to, let's say, join the European collaborative research, let's say, game. And that opens up a world for them. This is the only window that they currently have. So there's more to, let's say, science than just, organizing network meetings. Also at that level, the governments are really trying to make their pitch for being associated with the European Framework Program, for example, and Egypt recently joined. Obviously, this was Cairo. Ramses II, I also weaved in, but I'm going to move on. So, just one example of how politics can affect the cost program. You may remember 2016. At the other side of the channel, there was a referendum. Shall we join or not? And guess what? In the morning, we could read in the paper that the coin flipped in an unexpected way. And ultimately, about a year later, there was an official notification that the UK would withdraw, indeed, from the EU, with the prospect to leave then in 2 years' time. So there was a kind of a transition period. However, I think there was not a lot of agreement in the UK back then, and the Parliament in 2017 was then, of course, renewed. There was a general election, and nobody knew exactly what the status would be. Because at that time, Theresa May was replaced by Boris Johnson, and what would Boris do? Would he go for a, let's say hard or negotiated Brexit? And so there was another election to try to force the situation towards clarity. And so in December, we had in the UK again elections, and finally there was this agreement, a negotiated agreement, last moment, between the UK and the EU. So that was then leading to an exit officially on the 30th of January 2022. Now, why is this relevant to cost? The networks have grant holders, and we give them a grant on an annual basis. Up front, we pay 80% of the grant. And if the UK would leave without any negotiated, let's say, agreement, but also the participants would no longer be eligible to receive funding. And this is what we typically have at hand in the period of September-October, which is September-October, just before the general elections on the 12th of December 2019. So in this case, and I dare to say I, but of course in close consultation with my governance, I had to make a decision. Because we have 21 grant holders in the UK that together, when they receive 80% pre-financing, can increase, let's say, the amount altogether to an extent that it becomes an existential threat to cost, because we didn't have the reserves to back it up. Try to get your money back. So based on this risk analysis, there was a decision not to conclude a new grant agreement again with the UK-based institute, but to ask the network to find an institute outside the UK to act as a grant holder. I can assure you it was not received very well, but that was basically the situation. So in this case, we were affected by, let's say, politics. We took a risk-based decision and we imposed that the grant holder function had to be removed. Just to give you an impression of what the impact was, here you see the percentage of main proposers. So when we collect all the proposals, the UK traditionally was in the top 3, but often number 1 in the proposers, let's say, group. And in 2016, you immediately see a drop. And it was, in that sense, a bit remarkable because in the end, there was a negotiated, let's say, agreement. So the participants were still eligible to receive funding. But in the meantime, the word was going out and the EU framework program participation was also put to a halt. So the whole notion was we cannot participate. So you see there's an immediate impact. Now, since 2020, we have, of course, clarified this. And that actually led to a situation where, with a lot of promotion, targeted promotion in the UK, look, you can still participate in cost, led to a gradual uptake. So this is a direct, let's say, result of geopolitics. Now, completely different situation. Of course, we are witnessing the atrocities on a daily basis. We can follow this very closely in the newspapers, on the media. So Russia invades Ukraine. So the first thing we did was to make sure that Ukraine becomes a member, because they're part in the European sphere. And I ended up actually making a telephone call to the director of a national funding agency, who was the intermediary between us and cost. And when calling her, I found her in a bunker, sheltering from bombs. And she said, well, I'm so happy that you are calling, you know, because then we know that somebody outside of Ukraine is thinking about us. And so ultimately, we were able to reconnect and make, let's say, Ukraine a member. And of course, we waived the contribution fees. Now, the other side of the coin is that we received guidance from the European Commission, because we are paid 100% by the European Commission, to no longer allow funding of participants who are affiliated to institutes either in Russia or in Belarus, but not on basis of nationality. So if you're an Italian and are affiliated to, let's say, University of Moscow, you're out. But if you are a Russian affiliated to, let's say, the University of Trento, you're still eligible. I think that's an important nuance there. So that is what we did. So institutions in Russia can no longer receive funding, but researchers are not discriminated on the basis of their nationality. Now, what is the impact? The blue line represents Ukraine in terms of participation. So in how many actions of the 300 are you involved? We see Ukraine going up. And of course, we see Russia and Belarus going down. So this is an immediate impact of geopolitics on cost. Another one, and it's the last one that I will go into together with you. The EU sanctions against Hungary. Why were sanctions imposed on the first place? Because there was an act adopted that would give, without going into a lot of detail, a lot of interfering power in the governance of a number of institutes in Hungary, threatening the independence of these institutes. And that is not, quite frankly, in line with European values and also European, let's say, rule of law. And so the EU decides to implement sanctions in 2022. The Council with all the member states come together, and sometime later we got specific guidance from the European Commission. Said, look, you know, until further notice, individuals from these universities, and there's a list, are no longer able to receive funding. By the way, these institutes themselves cannot also act as a grant holder, but they are allowed to participate. And then later the Hungarian government basically responded to this by putting aside a national fund. They call this the guarantee fund. So they pay the participants directly. So here you see a different type of modality that is a result of, let's say, politics that we are exposed to. Now, long story short, what do we see? In green, the number of leadership positions, like a chair or a working group leader, they go down slightly. But the participation overall, the purple line, is still increasing. And that is due to the fact that, yes, you can still participate, but the government of Hungary will pay you and not us. So, in short, indeed, cost is bottom-up, inclusive, excellence-driven. We also, I would say, act as a science diplomat wherever we can. Because if, and we will talk about that later, I'm sure, If everything's break down, scientists still want to talk to one another. That is, let's say, the experience that we have. We are not a political body, obviously, but we are subject to policy making. And we are not, let's say, a private entity. We are not, let's say, a Wallenberg Foundation. We are paid with public money. And because we are paid with public money, there are some policy, let's say, aspects that are to be observed. So I'd like to keep it here, to keep it practical, and to offer this as a contribution for this evening. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Ronald, for this inspiring talk that I'm sure we'll get back to. So then the third speaker, we're rolling the lectern. Professor Robbert Dijkgraaf, University Professor and President-elect of ISC, who is going to talk about science at the crossroads, promises and perils.
Great, thank you. So it's wonderful to be here, and actually for perhaps one of the first times in my life, not giving a presentation while I was speaking. So I hope I will actually hope you can imagine the images that I want to project. To start with one image. So I joined the Dutch government 3.5 years ago. And there was a cartoon in the newspaper, and you saw me descending from a small ivory tower on a planet called Princeton into a big black hole called politics. So I'm very happy I'm outside the black hole again and share some of my experiences. And for those who understand it, you know, science and politics are a little bit complementary fields, and but they are very much interacting. So I hope you will enjoy some of the lessons that I want to share with you. And I think it's good to have this opportunity to discuss basically what the state of science is, how world politics and national politics is impacting our lives, and perhaps also in the discussion what we can do. Now, what is the state of science? So there is this anecdote that Leonid Brezhnev, was then the leader of the Soviet Union, was asked to assess in a single word what the state of the Soviet Union was. And his answer was good. And then the follow-up question, what would be his answer if he could use 2 words? And he said, not good. So I think that's my summary of science. So in one word, it's good. And I think it better be good, because I think there are unprecedented research opportunities. The way I like to frame it is that, you know, the big picture would be in the 20th century, we discovered the building blocks of matter, atoms, particles, of life, genes, DNA, of information, bits and algorithms. And now we are at the stage where we can actually, in principle, build anything we want out of those building blocks. So we are entering this area of artificial materials, of synthetic life, of rightly say that a fraction of natural phenomena that have been discovered is like 0, because I have this image that science has been traveling on this nice river, and now we're in the open ocean, an open ocean of infinite possibilities, but also I would say crashing waves and geopolitical currents. And also the pace of discovery accelerating. I'm not sure whether we have to believe everything that people are selling us about AI, but there are serious predictions that the rate of scientific discovery might increase tenfold, which means that all of us can live to the end, I hope, of the 21st century, perhaps the next century, which is extremely exciting. And my own experience is that there's really no policy issue where science doesn't make an impact. In the Dutch government that I was part of, I had a minister of nitrogen, because it's a big issue in high intensity agriculture. We had I like to say, a minister of carbon, which was the minister for climate. So quite and I said, I was the Minister of Education, so I was the Minister of Oxygen. But just to have ministers with their own molecules, that shows that it really makes an impact. And on top of that, there's of course an unprecedented talent pool. I think no time ever in science so many, particularly young people, were about and ready to join this adventure. And modern communication techniques allow us to really build a community. And I think we have a much greater diversity from different perspectives. One thing I like to say is that what science should, one of the quality of science is that not fitting into the system should also fit into the system. We are very expansive in the sense that we allow many different perspectives. So I think we should be optimistic. I think science is one of the most reliable source of optimism. We can discover new things, etc. So our lives should be terrific. So that's the one-word summary. But the two-word summary, of course, it's not good. Because if you just see what's happening in the world, we see unprecedented attacks on science, on academic freedom, on key institutions. By the way, not only in the United States, we see them around the world, also here in Europe. We saw some examples of self-destructive behavior, and the very pillars of knowledge are being attacked. So if we discuss the shrinking academic freedom, it's good to keep in mind a distinction that was catched by the British philosopher Isaiah Berlin. He spoke about negative and positive freedom. So negative freedom is the freedom of threats, and positive freedom is the freedom to act. So what may you do and what can you do? And in terms of negative freedom, we see many scholars face growing physical and online attacks. Half of all the climate scientists, half of all the virologists claim that they have been feel pressure, they've been threatened. And of course, we just mentioned the war in Ukraine, where research laboratories and universities are explicitly targeted as very vulnerable parts. We see in countries like the US that sensitive research topics like climate and vaccine and diversity, both biodiversity and human diversity, gender and social inequalities are being banned. We see universities being portrayed by populists as disconnected, elitist institution that face attacks because they are allegedly calling on excess political correctness. We see worrisome cases of self-censorship. If you all these pressures, you start to adapt to it, and cancel culture. And of course, we see these waves of alternative facts that, and fake science. There are a lot of sources of so-called science that really copy the peer review and the scientific journals that we are part of legitimate science. And on top of that, I think we see in many countries that science is increasingly seen through this kind of lens of economic benefit, which is really focusing on the short term instead of the long term. I wrote a short book with the title "The Usefulness of Useless Knowledge." And I think we, as basic scientists, know how important it is to set the human imagination free. On top of that, in terms of our worries, I would say that we see increasingly a lot of research drifting into from the public into the private sphere. If you see this year, by the way, also in spending patterns, if you take the top 5 US tech companies, they spent a total last year, 250 billion, which is twice the total public expenditure in Europe. You see infrastructure requirements, the next generation data centers at the order of 100 billion, and asking, the power of a city of 1 million inhabitants. So, and on top of that, also we are here mostly among physicists, but humanities and social science are particularly under pressure. They're being marginalized, and of course, they are absolutely crucial in understanding how all this technology will be brought. And around the topics that we are discussing here, we increasingly see kind of a zero-sum worldview where international scientific collaboration faces serious pressures and it becomes a threat to national security, to economic interest, and makes it more difficult to work, particularly with researchers from third member countries. So that all makes it really, really difficult. And by the way, we might discuss this more, this issue of research security, to which extent can we be open in science? And I love this image that actually a very high-level member shared with me of the US Department of Defense, who said, we are very worried about knowledge leaking out. But it's like she had the image of a leaking bucket. But she said it's also very important how wide we open the faucet. How much are we able to attract talent? In fact, a veteran researcher recently told me that who worked through the worst time of the Cold War. He said, the current atmosphere and lack of collaboration is worse than in the 1950s and 1960s. There are not only, and I would say, and this in contrast to the pressing challenges that we have, whether it's the planetary health, whether it's climate change or technical governance, that really needs next level of global cooperation. And we see much less sharing of data, particularly in crucial areas like the poles and the oceans. It used to be that scholars are at risk, but I think these days also data are at risk. And I think it's really ironic that in certain circles, these kind of need for worldwide guidelines, so as, for instance, the UN Sustainability Development Goals, they generate fierce backlash. So there are groups, particularly in certain tech circles, that see this demand from scientific voices to take care together of our planet as a threat to unconstrained industrial and technological developments, and some kind of a call of world government, which is, I think, really interesting. That certainly science is seen as the enemy, so to say, ideologically, of economic growth, while of course, science is actually underpinning much of those technologies. So anyhow, this is the not good part of the story. So what are some of the underlying causes? Because I think we have to dig deeper. And now, ironically, I think a lot of backlash that I see against science is a result of the success of science, of the impact that science makes. It presents uncomfortable truths to whether it's the environment or public health or social inequalities. And it's science pushing society, and I think partly society is pushing back. So it's an application of Newton's third law. Action is reaction, which is a good thing. But I think there's a second thing that really worries me, is that we see in our societies increased polarization. The polarization often is along educational fault lines. So it's the university-educated people and those who are more practically educated. And we see that the traditional broad support for science as a public good that benefits everyone is under pressure. And there are some groups which actually look at in a very critical way at the scientific enterprise. And so this is, I think, a challenge. And I think, it's an easy prediction that it will not go away automatically. Particularly, I think, this complicated interaction between science and politics. So there's a nice saying that if you mix science with politics, you get politics. But I think that's kind of too easy, because I think we all would like to see politics really supported by facts, by research. So we would like to scientifically, to scientize, so to say, politics. But of course, the reverse effect is that, scientists are being accused of being politicized. So how do you navigate these two different worlds? I said, when I jump into the black hole, we have some kind of case of black hole complementarity. If you think of what's the world of politics, it's largely it's short term. But just saying the average lifetime of a European science minister or any minister, I think, is 22 months. Shorter than a typical postdoc, I would say. It's emotional, it's ambiguous. As a politician, you never want to be very precise in what you say. It's national, it's zero-sum, because the total number of seats in parliaments is fixed. And interestingly, it's negative. Now, social scientists have found if politicians talk about a certain topic, people start to think more negative about it. That's why it's so productive to talk about topics like immigration, etc. It feeds it. The world of science, of course, is long-term. It's rational. We try to be as precise as possible. It's international. That's why we have this debate. We truly feel it's win-win. And as I said in the beginning, it's optimistic. So I think there's a real challenge how to navigate that interface with the given fact that the impact of science on society will only increase. That's unstoppable, because we will learn more about the world and we'll address more issues. But I think there's something that has to be done. And I like to kind of misquote Steven Weinberg. Weinberg had this wonderful quote where he says, in science, we usually learn about nature, but sometimes in science, we learn about science. He used it actually in the context of the anthropic principle, But sometimes in science, you learn what the right questions are. And I think here there is a moment where we have to think about how science has to be oriented in this new world with all these pressures and things going on into society. And I truly feel that there has been kind of a social contract between science and society for, I would say, the past 8 years. After all the institutions, the research institutions, the research councils were funded after World War II. There was this very impactful report by the science advisor to President Roosevelt, Vannevar Bush, Science, the Endless Frontier. And it basically said, science has been so productive for us in winning the World War II. How can it be of impact in times of peace? And it gave us, all the institutions gave us the whole framework. And I think that social contract where citizens spend tax money and to science, and we researchers give them the benefits of our insights, whether it's new medicines, whether it's new technology, or a new understanding of the world and the universe. I think that contract has to be renewed. So the question is, what can we do? What should science do? And the good thing is, by the way, and we'll have a discussion, but and I always like to say this when I was a Minister of Science with any questions, that's a good question because scientists can, or scholars can investigate this. So there's a lot of knowledge about how we as a scientific community operate and how we deal with these interfaces. But we need our colleagues in the social science and humanities to inform us. They have studied us and they can give important information about how we communicate, how we engage, and how we can navigate that complicated landscape. And so I think there are many things we can do. The first, actually, I think, perhaps the most important one, and I was in another panel discussion, and one of my American colleagues was in the panel discussion, and he was very much involved in the past in the whole civil rights movement in the US. And he said, there's this wonderful saying of Martin Luther King, who said, we need to organize the forces for good as well as as the organizers for bad, to say, are being organized. And so we should push back against the pushback. I think, we see these kind of attacks on science. It's very important that the scientific community organizes itself and actually, stand tall and pushes back. But I think there are also certain things that we can do in science itself. The first, I would say, is really work across the disciplines, because this is something that, is addressing the full wide spectrum of science. So, there's this kind of nice saying that, the world has problems, the university has departments. That's a little bit nasty remark to the university, but it's true. I think, if you see the big issues that we claim that we can solve and that we can address, we need the various disciplines to come together. I think, we have built this wonderful architecture of the research infrastructure, but there are a lot of interior walls that I think need not be there. And also, I think we have to work not only among the various scientific disciplines, but what's called transdisciplinary research. We should also involve people who in the end will be impacted by our research. Perhaps not so much in string theory, but in many other fields. I think it's very important to engage communities. And so open science sharing as long as, you know, if you can do it safely, the outcomes of research and data sets is incredibly important. It's important to build connections to our own communities in our countries, but actually also something that really worries me, which is the North-South divide that's coming up. So if you see actually, you know, from a global perspective, those countries that have to make the most difficult decisions, which are often the poorest countries, they have the least access to scientific knowledge. So that's incredibly unfair. And I think, you know, that's a good reason why we need global collaboration and help, you know, those countries which do not have the wonderful research infrastructures that we, for instance, here can cherish in Europe. I think also, you know, there are many reasons for us to have this kind of stronger engagement with society. You know, it's self-serving in the sense we would like to be funded. But I think, you know, we want to attract new talent. We also know it's a fertile ground for innovation, for new companies. But I think it's also very important that citizens are well informed because they have to make difficult decisions. They do it at a ballot box, the way they think about crucial issues. And I think also, and I think that's most fundamental, that we feel that the culture of science, you know, the respect for facts, of uncertainties, of having different kind of perspectives are not just scientific values, they're values that are incredibly important also for society as a whole. So what can we also do from the geopolitical framework? So what we see, you know, science is under attack, but I think, you know, international collaboration itself is under attack. You see in many countries, you know, we've seen it in the Netherlands, we see it in the US, we see it in the Netherlands, you see it in Sweden, it's in many countries, that development aid is the first thing to go. So international collaboration is under threat. Of course, the way it's being addressed in the US now really catches the headlines. But I think it's also a moment where a large part of the world realizes that, you know, we have been in some sense living under the umbrella of American generosity. You know, if you think of certain important research initiatives, whether it's, you know, infectious diseases in Africa or climate research, etc., some countries have been extremely generous. And I think, you know, this is something to realize and to see, you know, how other countries can kind of step up. So the multilateral system is a fancy word to describe the UN and all its affiliated organizations. Is under pressure too. You know, they're seeing funding cuts. There are, you know, undermined by many different countries. So the formal, I would say, the first ring of international collaboration, the political one, is under pressure. And I think that's why we, as a scientific community, being in the second ring, play a very important role. You know, we already saw some international. We already saw good examples in the past how the scientific community has kind of stepped up, where in some sense the political one didn't dare to. So I think as scientists we're not in the splash zone, which the politicians are, but that means that kind of the second ring can play a very important role. The International Science Council, which I'm kind of elected to lead, is kind of an interesting organization. If it had many iterations, but started in the late 19th century, when the academies of some large countries had the brilliant idea that perhaps international collaboration is a natural thing for science. You know, it was interesting. It's like not only the major European countries, but both Russia and the US were part of it. And I was looking at some of the notes of that first meeting in 1900, and then they write, well, scientific contact often predates political and economic collaboration. And I think it was true in 1900, it's even more true in this time. And in fact, they were quite ambitious. I love the fact, there's just one little anecdote. One of the first initiatives was to study brain. And they were sent a letter to all the countries saying, well, we want to study the brain, but the brain is as complicated as the stars in heaven. And so each country should pick a part of the brain, create an institute, and they should form a network. And in the Netherlands, we did this. Now we created, and the oldest independent research institute is this Neurosciences Institute that still exists. So we need also, I think, imaginative and brave initiatives. We have seen the Science Council, for instance, during the Cold War started the Polar Year, which was really a way in which adversaries were collaborating on Arctic research, etc. So I think there are many, many, many examples. And finally, let me say, I think there's a special role for Europe, because this is a conference of EuroStrings. So why does Europe have a special role? I think there's a historic one. If you see how modern science developed in the 16th, 17th century, it was this very strange mix of collaboration and competition in the many European countries, like this famous Republic of Letters, of course, using the input of many other cultures and countries. And so I think, this kind of very fertile mix was extremely productive in the past. And I think, we have a tradition there. I think there are two kind of elements of strength of Europe. The first, I would say, is the fact that the European collaborative model is very open. We saw a beautiful presentation of cost, and you saw the various rings in which kind of countries can collaborate. I think this actually is a very productive model, almost like a scale model for the world. You find like-minded countries, you form various kinds of collaborations. And in a time where there are kind of superpowers in the world, I think this kind of collaborative model is a good third kind of form of alternative. So I think Europe should do this. But the second element is our values, and that might, I think, be Europe's unique selling point. I think it's not only about structure, it's also about culture. I think academic freedom, research integrity, transparency, open data, given particular young researchers a lot of responsibility. There's a very strong program, perhaps you know of this, in Europe to have different ways to assess research, this kind of, and also to think of the various roles in the scientific enterprise. So the distinction between more what used to be between research and support roles or academic or technical careers. I think there are a lot of ways in which Europe can innovate and make the scientific climate more attractive. And I think this is something that, is incredibly important. But finally, I would say that, and it's wonderful to have many young scientists here. It's good to see that you're part of this tradition, in particular, I think, as particle physicist, a theoretical physicist, part of a long tradition where our community has stepped up and formed these international collaborations. And I think, we need audacious initiatives, we need fresh thinking. It would be good if all of us spent all of our time, of course, thinking about the latest development of string theory, but if you can use 1% of your energy and time in thinking about how we can address these tensions and what role the scientific community can play, I think that will be incredibly important, and we're counting on you. Thank you very much.
A lot for a very inspiring talk, Robert. Yes, then we turn to the panel debate. We have to make some space for so you as the panelist to sit.
Okay. Then I will wait for Robert. Huh?
Yeah, so the intention is that this should become a good and interactive discussion. So primarily between the audience and the panel members, but of course the panel members are also really invited to challenge each other a little bit. Just to get so I will very soon throw the floor open. I think also, especially, I really invite especially the young people, and it's very nice you highlighted this at the end, Robert, to engage in this because, well, it's a platitude, but yeah, the future is yours. So I think we need precisely good ideas and remarks from the young generation, but they shouldn't dissuade the wise, slightly more mature people in the audience to also make comments. Yeah, so I will not repeat the talks, but I think, there are some really interesting points raised about governance and neutrality, about openness versus security, about mobility and collaboration. Like I said, I will throw open the floor soon, but I just wanted to do a little quick round of each panel member. Because when we think about science and geopolitics, we think about that science could play different roles. And one that comes to mind is, well, just we should produce more knowledge because then we are better. There's some sort of competition. A second one is maybe more defensive, but we should use science to become more resilient and sort of shield ourselves from the rest of the world. And a third, that was also mentioned by many, is more like we should use science as a tool in diplomacy. Now, it's always a very tricky question to say what's the most important, but just to challenge you a little bit, starting with Robert and then Ronald and Mieke. Can you say something about the prioritization of these?
Well, I would say the most important thing that science does is really, improve our lives. I think that, it delivers the results. And, it's interesting looking backwards. We see this kind of tremendous examples. There are many things in the world that are less successful than they claim to be. But I think science is really an exception. I think we have over-delivered in many, many ways. People haven't been able to imagine the kind of breakthroughs and insights that we have had. So I think part of this, what I call the social contract with society, is of course that science actually delivers on its promises. And I think that should drive us, and we should also seriously think, are you doing the right things? I think, we have a real question, how can we optimize science to do all those things? It's not only, economic benefit. I think it's also like cultural benefit. It's, it's making our lives more meaningful. And all of the above, I would say. And I think that is in the end where you find support. And in my experience also, also from politics, there are many issues that divide, but science typically does not. And again, it's win-win. And if you, for instance, ask about science diplomacy, it's exactly that what makes it such an interesting tool in diplomacy. And because, you can benefit in many ways in collaborating because you clearly have more brain power, but also often the issues that you're addressing, whether it's a pandemic or understanding the atmosphere or the ocean, obviously, you want to do that on a planetary scale. But I would say, we should be very proud that we can actually have truth in advertising.
Perfect. What's your take on this?
Yeah, it's all three, true at the same time, obviously. But if you ask me, of course, because I represent cost. First of all, I fully agree. You mentioned oxygen. I think that is really, the catchword to describe, how much we need science. In our experience, to see people coming together in these networks, young, old, occasionally a Nobel Prize winner, although often in retrospect, because I've been in a cost issue with somebody who 20 years later got a Nobel Prize. But yeah, that to see the spark in people's eyes. So this is truly unique because this is a network of peers, and I would never have been able to make the connection. And what is it actually that binds them? They're all seeking the truth, right? And that is I think very fascinating. Apart from that, making the connections, let's say, between scientists is one thing, but it's also something that can open, let's say, collaboration levels, between governments, between administrations. I just showed a picture from one of the missions I did to Egypt, and then you have people from Palestine also. Don't ask the itinerary of this person because they don't have their own airport. He has to go through Israel, then to the West Bank, and then they can go out. But at one occasion, it was the year before, I had, if you look at that map, I had the club of full members and I had the near neighbor countries. So in one single room, I had Azerbaijani and Armenian, where we know there's a history of conflict. I had a Serbian and a Kosovar representative, and I had an Israeli and a Palestinian in one room. But we were talking about science, not politics. And I think those are the moments that I say, yeah, this gives me at least a fulfillment to say, yeah, we are fulfilling our mission, you know, maybe even more profoundly than we realize. And science is so important in this.
Beautifully said. Mickey, what is your take?
Yeah, it's a very big question, and I think my take on this is that when you start thinking about science and you realize that this is it sort of stems from our curiosity in the beginning, and then science at some point it develops into technology because our curiosity gives us means to improve our situation, our society situation. And if it would stay at that, science alone would be a very, very, very good thing. But since there's always competition, as soon as you make an invention, either your situation will become better, or you make an invention to make the other guy's situation become worse. And that's very delicate because, of course, it's just curiosity. I break this stone or whatever I'm doing. I'm starting on very basic science here. But very quickly it escalates, and the impact of science goes beyond the curiosity and sort of, let's call it the big grand goals. We had a good example here that Einstein sitting down and writing his equations and doing quite academic studies. But today, our GPS systems wouldn't work without that. There was no intention at all. I don't think he sat down first, oh, I want to build a GPS system. How does that work? No, this evolves. And the problem with the science is this, that the curiosity brings you something at hand, but then what you do with it is the important thing. And this is hard because perhaps it's not only up to the scientists, because then you start interacting with society. And we are talking about the 20th century being fantastic for science, but you should also remember a lot of it was driven about the disasters in the early part, where we really pushed together to make sure that we could win over the other side. Not taking sides here, but this is what was a brain. But coming out of that was also the initiative that came after the war to build the peace. So it's really hard to give a good, simple answer to this. And well, I'll end there because you can spin on forever because this is such a big question, and it's a very interesting and important question to always think and look at different facets and twist and turn, because in our everyday life as scientists, we will face times where we have to make choices about what you're doing. And this is also, then you go down to also the ethics of science. So it's extremely broad question that you asked us to summarize in a minute. You're not fair.
No, well,
It's not a fair world, is it?
It's not a fair world.
I think it really drew out some very great nuances, and yeah, well, it highlighted that it's a big question with many angles. But so yeah, the floor is open to people in the audience to ask a question. If you want to address it to a particular person in the panel, you're also very welcome to do that. Yes.
So I had a question also coming back to the observation of the advantage of having different people in the same room from different countries that may not be in good terms with each other. So what are good examples where actual scientific collaborations could help reduce geopolitical tensions? And how can we ensure this in the future, especially in these times?
So if I think that is a question addressed to me. Yeah, that is of course a very big leap. So there is a meeting, and how does this link to solving a major conflict between countries? That's a big step. Okay, so I don't pretend necessarily to give you a concrete example. If I had one, it would be in the newspapers already. But what I see is that, let me put it the other way around. I take the negative one. We once had a high-level representative at the European Commission, Mrs. Mogherini. And she had to go on a, let's say, a mission to Morocco. Yeah, what do we do with Morocco? Not too much, actually. We only talk about how can we block as many people coming in from Morocco to Europe. That's basically the main thing. And so how do you break the ice? How do you not go with the negative only to Morocco? How do you build a connection to bring something along? And the only thing that she could find was science. It's good that I have science in my bag because I have something to offer. And so that illustrates something that, in my opinion, science or scientific collaboration has a value that could, in the end, also contribute, even in a tiny way, to fostering good relations and a peaceful coexistence. I can give you a few other examples, but it's just one of those things, one of those anecdotes where I say, yeah, there is a value in science more than just the science. I hope that is an answer to your question.
If I can add something to it, there are many examples during the Cold War, for instance, where US and Soviet scientists, particularly I think on nuclear issues, were in close contact, and this helped a lot with the disarmament talks. Another good example is actually the relation between West German and East German scientists also during the Cold War. So these contacts were already there. So when the Iron Curtain fell, they already had those collaborations, and they could start, building from that, more deeper ways to integrate the two countries. So I think there are many examples where, there are these kind of scientific contacts that are already there. And often I think, scientists meet each other and then go up and do other things. They might go into another roles, might go into industry and politics, whatever. And then they keep the contacts, etc. So I think there are not that many areas where there are some safe spaces for scientists, for people to meet from countries that have a very difficult relationship.
Yeah.
You want to add something to it, or?
No, I'm fine.
That's good, because then I have a really tough question for you just in between. Like, you lead an institute, NORDITA. So what are sort of your threshold conditions? Because I think, well, maybe the first part of the question is, to what extent should institutes be neutral? The second part is, what are sort of threshold conditions to terminate collaborations, MOUs? I mean, it's a very concrete question, but you actually gave some examples of cost handling this in different ways, in different sanctions.
So it's a very difficult question, and it's also an everyday question that we have to address. And I think when we have an institute which has a mission, in this case theoretical physics, we need to look at the individual first and see how the individuals can prosper and grow and contribute as individuals to society. Because if we look at science, one would like to have the standing point that science is something for mankind. It's not for countries or organizations. It's really something for everyone's benefit. You mentioned there are so many challenges that we can actually resolve if we are rational and work scientifically. So it's extremely important to be open in that sense. On the other hand, one cannot be naive, because not everyone is kind out there. So you have to have this very subtle balance. And as if you lead an institute from the outside, the decisions you have to make might look a bit funny or hard to explain, because you have sometimes some information or some things that you have to adjust to, and there's no way around, because they are then politics enter, and of course we have to make ethical standpoints against aggressors and so on, and that will exclude a lot of institutes to work with. So I think it's called a Janus phase, everything, that you have two sides of of everything, and this is every day. It's everywhere in the world that you have to face. There are good things and bad things, and you have to make the right priorities based, hopefully, on having the right compass.
Thanks a lot.
Can I add something to it? Because I think it's really, it's one of these issues where I would say neither the politics nor the scientists really want to take up the responsibility. So I think setting the guidelines, with whom can we collaborate, under which conditions. Often, scientists or universities say to ministries or politicians, you make the decision. But I would actually say, from my own experience, they cannot, because it's too coarse-grained. It's too much of a caricature. And even the intelligence services, they worry about various things, but I don't think they have the in-depth knowledge to make these kind of decisions. And it should be fine surgery. You shouldn't bring an axe to it. And so I think my experience is, in the end, this comes back to the scientific community, because I think details matter. And to make the decision, is this something which is really crucial piece of technology that we don't want to share, or is this something which is very generic and everybody could do it? I think only the specialists who know this. So I think this will be something that will be on the plate of the scientists from the scientific community, and it should be there.
Yeah, in general terms, the red line for cost is that we are only funding networks for peaceful purposes, right? But it's very high level. To make it more concrete, and I didn't want to go in my talk into the situation that we are currently witnessing in Israel and Gaza. But I can share with you, and it's something that, of course, you would expect. I'm getting mails from action chairs from Belgian institutes, for example, that said, well, we decide in our action that there's no Israeli researcher anymore. And then, because my university has adopted a policy that we are no longer allowed to cooperate with Israeli researchers. And then I send a polite message back, said, well, you're receiving a grant from COST, bound to an action grant agreement, where we have certain rules of cooperation. In a polite way, better than saying, well, either you like it or you leave it, yeah, basically. So what I have not seen so far is that the collective of the members that constitute our governance, including Israel, by the way, is part of that, has unilaterally decided to exclude people from other countries. In the case of Brexit, it was more a management decision. So, look, we have too much risk. So, of course, I work with our governance, but okay, just to back myself. But in the case of Hungary, there was no, let's say, initiative from the members. In the case of Ukraine, to cancel out Belarus and Russia was not coming from the members. So the intrinsic, let's say, attitude is, sure, we collaborate, right? And so yeah, what we will now see in the situation what I was just referring to with Gaza and Israel, of course, recently the Dutch government faction of one party stepped down because of that. Will there be consequences at the European level, for example, whether there indeed will be a decision by the European Council of Ministers to take sanctions, to, for example, stop the association agreement or to freeze it, or maybe partly with the framework program. This was all mentioned. We could all read it in the newspaper. COST has not taken the initiative. Can you imagine you have Israel on your board and then you discuss this? This is very, very, very sensitive. So if there will be a decision, then say, okay, then the Commission will say, well, we now give you guidance, as it is called. So we will follow the same path as with the other examples, but we're not there yet. But it's this is simply what is happening around us. We cannot affect it, but we have to deal with it.
Thanks. Yes.
Ronald, thanks. I was going to ask you, but exactly, you answered a question I was going to ask. But let me just follow up. So in the case of the sanctions against scientists with Russian affiliations, you said this decision did not come from the members. Where did it come from then?
From the European Commission. And that was because the European Council decided to impose sanctions on Hungarian institutes where there was, let's say, an interference of government on the government side, compromising the independence of these organizations. That is the rationale that was followed. And so we receive our funding 100% from one single grant that we conclude with the European Commission. So as a matter of consistency, this translates then at the level of cost in, well, you cannot allow any more institutes that we have put on our blacklist to benefit. So any researcher that is related or affiliated to this, irrespective of their nationality or so, can no longer receive, let's say, funding. They can participate, but no longer funding. And so in that particular case, and this applies until further notice.
And do the members and researchers have a say in this at all?
No.
Okay, thank you.
No. That is the debate, of course, because the researchers, they want to collaborate. Right? So, like I said, also our members, these are also countries, do not have an intrinsic motivation to start, this kind of discussions leading to sanctions.
Do panel members want to follow up, or should we go? Let me go to the next question.
Right. So thanks for your interesting talks. So the title, this is on, right? Yeah. The title is the role of science in times of what was it? Geopolitical uncertainties. So I want to ask a question about the role of scientists in these times, and in particular to Robbert, actually. So you said, okay, we have to. There's a social contract that there used to be that is being torn apart, and you say we should renew it. So I would like to ask you what we can do as scientists. What should we do? And of course, you're going to say, well, we should talk to the social scientists because they have expertise. But you're also kind of an expert. You have a long expertise. So I was wondering what you think we should do and where we can start.
I think actually there are many things you can do, in terms of like building the trust of science. I think individual scientists can do a lot. In fact, it's interesting that research shows that if there is lack of trust, it's often in institutions, particularly institutions that have been much in the news, making recommendations, etc., whether it's on vaccines or, climate, much less on individual scientists. So I think that's really interesting starting point, that science is something different than the institutions. So it's a big collective. So I think as individual scientists, you can do a lot of reaching out. I think actually, there's quite a wealth of initiatives in various countries of, engagement in locally and in schools, etc. So I think that this is something that we can do, that each of us can do. There are many roles to play. You can write about science, show things, etc. You can be engaged in a lot of activities. I think that actually brings science much closer to people. Political parties often, to be perhaps a bit too frank, but sometimes I feel scientists also feel they're above politics, because it's like this messy thing, etc. But of course, politics cannot be above the facts. So, there is, I think, also a role to engage with politicians, and particularly with politicians, I would say, of the wrong political party, who are perhaps not embracing the scientific consensus. So I think, I like to say we start to feel comfortable being not comfortable. And I think this is what all of us can do. We can do it in a much more organized way. And I think that's a lot of initiatives that you can take. And I think this is something that I see as an expanded role of science. It's not only that we do terrific in research, but we also play an important role, I think, in building the support that in the end then gives the research. So, and I think you can do this also as an individual scientist, each of us in their own way. And by the way, not all of us have to do this. I think it's very important. There are those who enjoy it. And so often I say, and also not be afraid to, do public service. I often feel that, there's a real lack of scientists in circles of policies and politics because, it's very messy, etc. But if one of us now and then wants to jump in, I think it would be good. In the black hole, you can survive. You can come out.
You came out on the other end, Robert.
Totally scrambled, that's Hawking radiation.
Thank you.
This is a little bit off topic, but it does relate to the topic of the decreasing trust in science. So you've talked a lot about the general public, but there's also sometimes a sort of threat within. I think an example close to home for string theorists is people that came from the community that then say that string theory might not be a real science, and I think there's more examples like that, maybe in social sciences where people might not appreciate science for the sake of science so much. I know that there's a GPS example, but it's a well-used one. How do you think about mending those fractures within the scientific community of people that have fallen out and attack science from the outside, but that came from within?
Yeah, I think that's really an important question because often those, I would say, in the most positive light, very fierce discussion within the scientific community are perceived from the outside as being that we don't know what we're doing. And, again, it's a big mess. I don't think that, one strategy be to have a united front, etc. But I think that wouldn't be fair because, we want to, in some sense, be honest in the way we present science and that there is a certain amount of discussion around topics, I think is a good thing. But I do feel sometimes, sometimes you see a family, on holidays that are fighting among themselves, not realizing that the whole restaurant is enjoying the conversation. And sometimes I feel we're a little bit like this. So we should, I think, we should be aware in some sense that we are part of that image. And it's interesting if you see the research about trust in science. So the first important thing is we are still among the most trusted part in society. Scientists are trusted much more than journalists or politicians in particular. And if you ask why do people trust science, it's not because they fully understand, the difference between string theory and loop quantum gravity or something. It's because they see a large community agreeing at some point on things which are very difficult. So the fact that there are very difficult things that, there's some sense of agreement, particularly, by the way, the fact that these are scientists from various different countries and like they build, if people are enthusiastic about the Higgs particle, it's not, I think, because they understand what the Higgs particle is. But you have 10,000 people working at CERN and they all are excited, and celebrate. And that image, that there is some truth and it has been discovered and it's done collectively, I think that's a very powerful image. So I think in communicating what science is, it's also very important that we communicate the scientific method, which there isn't really a scientific method, but our methods, And it's also important for us to communicate that our strength is not that I think we are better human beings or something, But I think our strength, and this is actually something that the social scientists tell us, is in our collective. It's the way we have peer review, how we debate, how we come to a consensus on certain topics, and perhaps not a consensus on others. And I think communicating that, some sense the culture of science, is an important part, I think, of doing outreach. But I think you are right that if you have very intense debates, we have to be aware that the rest of the world is looking at us.
Yeah. Any of you have?
Yeah, I was thinking a little. It's a very interesting discussion and a question indeed. I mean, in the field of physics, one have different stages of the scientific development, but at the core, it's empirical, right? So we can always fall back on experiments and some kind of understanding and confirmation of theory in this case. And on the way there might be various ways. And then you have this internal debate, which actually is quite developing because you can understand and see the different angles and so on. Where it becomes difficult, where I see, or I think we all see it, is today when we have certain facts about climate, which are scientific, which are being debated and revoked because, one, they are uncomfortable. And here, then scientists can come in a very different, and science can come in a very different perspective, because if you deny climate change, for instance, or how do you work with this? You can have different interpretations, and they can be driven not only by empirical facts, but also by personal conviction. And then this is also a part, because the question is much larger than let's call physics science, but the whole field of science, because that's so complex and there are so many ingredients. And when the debate comes there, then that could be dangerous for the scientists, because when do we pass over to opinions, to facts? Yeah. And this is where we're now. I mean, there are also, fake news and all this, that you can debate anything. Anything is suddenly volatile, right? You can question anything, and that has come from somewhere. And that can also come from a public distrust in an elite or a scientific community, a know-it-all community imposing things. And so what you proposed there, this in the previous question, actually, I'm a little bit of a slow thinker, so I'm catching up now. But there, the point of being a part in the current debate and taking that uncomfortable step is quite important. And as you say, not everyone should do it, but those who are well posed to do it should be more open there, because we need to introduce more scientific thinking into the debate and do it in the right way, not trying to, point a finger, but really get it settled into the mindset. And we have to recapture that, because suddenly it has been so questioned.
I fully agree, and I think that's what I said. You have to push back against the pushback. It's a second order effect. We think science is terrific, and everybody is agreeing, and then you get pushback, and then perhaps you're perhaps a bit naive. So how can people push back science? Because isn't that the most wonderful thing there is? Well, no. We have to defend it, so we have to organize ourselves and push back against the pushback.
Question in the back, then here, and then there. So yeah, we have an order now.
Thank you for your insight. I have a maybe more broad strokes question, which is, you indicated a little bit the relation between science and inequality in a sort of broader sense. So you talked about this north-south divide, for instance. And I would like to, let's say, posit, I mean, certainly historically, I think we all accept that participating in science has been a matter of privilege in some sense, like very much, Isaac Newton was a wealthy aristocrat, I don't remember. And even today, I would like to posit this is still the case, that there is some distinction in socioeconomic background and gender and whatever else you might have, even in wealthy countries. And that may be actually also same with politics, incidentally. and that part of this is maybe responsible for the stigmatization and antagonization of the scientific community. And I would like to ask if you have any suggestions as to strategies as to how we can make science, not just the consumption of science, but also the participation in science more accessible, such that it becomes more of a publicly accepted good and part of ordinary life.
I think if I can start, it's a very good question. And, if you look at, I mentioned this kind of influential report of Vannevar Bush, in 1945, and it set up, the modern development of science. There was one thing really missing in that report, which was that it was inclusive, that everybody could join the scientific adventure. It was still a very elitist point of view. And I think, one thing we have learned in science is that it's to our benefit to be inclusive. I like to say not inclusive, expansive. Science it's not about you fitting into the system, it's the system expanding so that you can fit in. And there are many underrepresented groups, I think, in all of our societies, whether it's gender, whether it's race, whether it's ethnicity. Often the most invisible one is social economic. There are many students who are first-generation students, have a much more difficult time. So I think there's more insights now, I think, within universities, colleges, research institutes that we should pay a special attention to, that everybody is welcome. But I think it would go further. I mean, if we think that research is something that only takes place at elite universities, it's a wrong role of what research is. I think, if you are very practical vocational training, there can still be a research component to it or something. So, traditionally, you mentioned, some of the famous scientists in the past who become very privileged, etc. Newton, by the way, wasn't, although, well, his mother, I think, had some money, but it's, he certainly was not an aristocrat. And traditionally, science has also been a social engine, something. And one thing that you see, for instance, very clearly in the United States, that the top universities stop being that, right? They're very kind of self-affirming, elitist institutions. And I think this is something that's undercutting in that country, but in other countries too. The image that people have of universities, it's no longer, they're no longer open for everything. And this plays a role in the dynamics in our society. But as you said, at a global scale, this is happening, in a much more dramatic way. So I think it's very important as a scientific community, we are aware of that. And there are many ways you can address this. I always like, and of course, it's now much under attack in the US and elsewhere, but this difference between equality and equity, it's not about the door is open for everyone. Because if you're very far away with lots of barriers, the fact that the door is open, is of very little use. Equity is to make sure that you have the same kind of opportunities to actually enter the door. And so you have to do more for those who are coming from further away. And actually, some of that is set by the policies of governments, etc. But I think a lot of it is also set by ourselves. The scientific community can do a lot, whether, targeting scholarships, make sure that if you have a conference, and people have, say, young families, etc., are you taking care of childcare? There are lots of things you can do to avoid making it a very exclusive thing. And I think the good news is over the past decades that we at least become more sensitive to it. But I think still there's a lot of things that we can improve. And I think, again, if we talked about the geopolitical tensions between the big power blocks, but I think the tension that's between North and South, is as important. We haven't discussed a lot about it, but international aid is being cut across the world. It's the least popular thing in political parties, and it makes a tremendous impact on the world. And I think, as a scientific community, you should be very open to this and see what we can do. And with very little money, you can do a lot.
Yeah, just because this is about this equality and inclusiveness, and how do you actually, counter this? And I can share with you that with cost, we have a specific policy, an excellence and inclusiveness policy. I just earlier on showed you a picture of the map with the full members with more research intense and less research intense countries, even with 2 color codes. We have a requirement that comes with the grant that we receive from the commission that at least 50% of the money that is given to researchers lands in the pocket of less research intensive countries. So we have specific mechanisms, let's say, by setting certain criteria at the proposal stage or also in the evaluation stage with some extra supporting measures to achieve that. And the bulk, let's say, it's about 70-30, so 70% comes from the research intense countries. So you have to really find a mechanism without, and that's what we have always tried and maintained successfully, without interfering in the freedom for the action to organize itself. So we don't tell a specific action, you have to do this, but we organize it in such a way that these people can contribute, that they are invited, because it is a misconception, but now I'm riding the horse a little bit of cost, that there's no excellence in those so-called, less research intensive countries. There's excellence everywhere, pockets of excellence. The thing is, how do you connect them? How do you bring them together? And once, at least in cost, they are in a network, they have the same opportunities, but also the same equity. And that is, I think, one of the ways to do it, to make sure that we have, let's say, a capitalization on all the talents that are available in Europe. And that not just as in the wider framework program of the European Union, there's always a specific club of institutions or research organizations and universities, that know how to play the game. They have the money to invest into putting proposals forward, that they always are amongst the winners. That is a little bit, of course, what we need to counter in that sense. So that's a different angle, but it's also alluding to inclusiveness.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. I know there are other questions. I just would like to ask. So you talked a lot about the conflicts and the mistrust, what actually the situation is at the moment, and a lot of blame is usually posed on the political environment, policies, and people in power. But is there anything that you think the community itself should look back and perhaps recognize that could have contributed to actually this situation, and actually recognize it in order to avoid it in the future? Is there anything that we have done wrong?
Well, if I can start, I think perhaps, as I said, we have become a little bit not spoiled, but demanding this kind of support without feeling that we have to do anything in return. And so I think this is something that I feel this a little bit like a wake-up moment. I think it's good for science in the end, but that you have lost contact with part of society, or whether it's the political circles or just public in general, it's just a fact. And I think in retrospect, we could have perhaps done more in kind of doing this kind of public engagement. And of course, it's a very difficult question, but probably there are lots of missed opportunities right now. So I think it's a really good question. And one thing I noticed that we saw some good examples of really, I would say, very imaginative initiatives in the past. bridging, in a very complicated world. It's not that the world, in the 1950s or 60s was all easy, etc. It was all high tension, etc. And the people were able to think not only about their research, but also how the research was organized, I think. And I feel we should perhaps haven't thought enough about the architecture of the whole research enterprise. And I think this is kind of a moment that you look at the building and say, wait a moment, we can do it in a smarter way. And I think there are many ideas. But I feel there is some kind of maintenance that we didn't do and that we now have to do.
Yeah, there is some risk in public engagement, of course, because during the time of COVID, in the end, it were politicians, of course, that had to make very difficult decisions on what measures to take. And more often than not, gradually, we have seen, of course, scientists being put to the forefront to basically explain the situation and how bad things were or not, and how much risk. But that was immediately then connected to decisions that could be arbitrary, but not necessarily, let's say, scientific, but of course policy-driven. And that was, of course, something that led to situations of lockdowns. And the risk that you actually introduced there is that indirectly, lockdowns are associated with scientists. There has been a big backlash. And at the same time, and that's the paradox, science has helped us to get out of this pandemic. Yeah, with these RNA vaccines. So it's I think no option not to engage. We should engage. We should push back. Robert, I think also in your words, but it comes with a risk. So where is the policy engagement and where does it stop? Because we've also seen, I live in Belgium now for the last years, with a very, let's say, communicative scientist who was at the forefront, but at a huge personal cost of threats and law cases against this person personally. So suffered a lot because of that. So this is a bit of an extreme example. That's the society that apparently we are living at the moment.
If I can just say one word about it, because I think COVID is a wonderful example, where on the one hand, as you said, delivery of vaccines was tremendous success. So I thought that actually was the Sputnik moment of our days, that people would all say, well, we see the value of science. But I think you're quite right to saying that, at some point, science can show various paths and see what are the results if you choose a certain path. But the decision which path to take is a political decision. And so another lesson, I think, would be don't get framed by politicians as being responsible for certain choices. I think because that's just what happened. And at some point also be careful where you cross this divide. You're going to the black hole horizon, I think. And that's where, because the decisions are actually political decisions and they have to be taken democratically, and this is not something that science can do.
Yeah.
In some sense, I think you alluded to that in your presentation, is we are a bit a victim of our own success, and in particular after post-World War II, because the delivery from science to society has been enormous in new technologies, new discoveries that have been very quickly put into use. With enormous, and this has, with the growth of population in science, this speed has grown. But of course, it's a political decision what to fund and so on. And perhaps this has been seen a little bit like a possibility that we put in some money there and we know what we get back and so on. So the policies perhaps have been driven on wrong expectation and a mismatch of timescales now on becoming scientific, right? Because science doesn't have a clear timescale in a sense. Now, the vaccine was special. There was a very urgent and there was a very strong thrust, and probably a lot of the ideas were half mature already, right? But in the long term, we are looking, so the EU put this flagship notion, and I was a little bit involved in that. And we have a 2D material, and what happens? The scientists and we start promising a lot of technology, and okay, let's put $1 billion into it. Let's see what we get back. And of course, then it's written not back a lot got it back in form of technology, but the evolvement of quantum materials and what we can do with this material has grown fantastic, and it's just an enormous explosion. But there's no cash back yet. And being part of actually the administration and running of the flagship, I realized that we were actually lab rats in the EU's way of thinking on how to fund science. So we had weekly meetings, and okay, we changed that. What happens there? And it was quite interesting. So there is a funny reaction with the politics wondering, okay, how do we make as much bang for the buck? So they have mostly an honest goal. It's sometimes you polarize it with the scientist in white armor and then the politicians in the black hole, as you want to put it. But one has to realize that in a sense, we are a bit, we have made our own problem by being very successful. This is funny because we should be proud of that. But the expectation of our delivery is perhaps overrated in a sense, which is it sounds very negative to the science, but you expect a quick turnaround in the invested public funding that goes into science, and that won't happen, I think. And there's a mismatch, and policies makes it worse because, it's not the right driving, always the right driving force.
On a slightly lighter note, I have a sort of rhetorical question for Robbert. If one jumps in a black hole and comes back on the other side after a scrambling time, do you think they should again try to fall back in the black hole at some point?
Well, you never say never, but no, I think actually, honestly, I found being in government incredibly worthwhile. Because, one thing you definitely cannot say that it doesn't matter, because, as a minister, you make decisions, etc. And I also had an experience that as a scientist in politics and government, you have a special role to play. You have a slightly different way of communicating with Parliament. You probably are not selling a political point of view. You want to understand things, and so one thing I felt, that I've really missed in politics. So what we would have, if we would discuss this as an issue, we would say, well, let's clean the blackboard, and can somebody just explain to me why are we discussing this, right? And that's like a nice summary talk or something. That would be the first thing to do. Usually people do not do this in politics. They take action. Why? Because last week they did this, that, and there's that report and that, motion in Parliament, etc. And I think there's tremendous need and demand for these kind of moments. So I think, science can play a very important role just by asking fundamental questions. You know, why are we discussing this? You know, what are we optimizing? You know, what is exactly, for instance, many of the problems in politics are over-constrained. People don't realize that, you know, they want to optimize 10 different things and they have only 3 dials. So even to explain this concept was very new to many people. Yeah. That you have more constraints than variables. So there are a lot of kind of things that you can do. And now you can do it as a minister, but you can also do it by just helping politicians, etc. So I think there's a real lack of scientific thinking in politics, was my experience. And even though those who were dealing with like scientific issues, often the arguments were political arguments. You know, I can find a majority for this or a majority for that. Well, I think, the great thing that a science background tells you, that you first want to understand the issue and then you want to explain it. And in fact, that's often a way to also bring, as I said, science brings people together, but I think a scientific way to approach also political issues can bring people together, and there's a real need for that. So I hope perhaps some of you will jump into black hole. Could be a micro black hole, you might already be in it.
For those of you who would enthusiastically follow the suggestion of Robbert, just bear in mind that science is about finding the truth, but democracy is about finding majorities. And they're not necessarily compatible.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're quite right by addressing there are many pressures in some sense that work against, the openly sharing, and I think you said quite rightly, that we have seen the values of sharing. You mentioned the vaccine. So, clearly by sharing that information was extremely important in getting the vaccines fast. And then, of course, it was very disappointing when it was the distribution of vaccines that is kind of this generous sharing attitude was not there. And as you said, many economic arguments that now work against sharing. So again, it's a tricky thing where I feel, it's a trade-off, but I see many of the forces, and they're quite strong, are in the, trying to close things off, because it's either a risk, it might be seen as a very generous risk. It's in private companies, etc. There are a lot of things that are somehow getting more and more shielded. And I think, the scientific community plays a very important role in pushing the other direction. And as I said, one way to do this is to make these decisions more scientifically informed. I was part of a discussion where people said, anything related to quantum is, have to be secured or something, and I was like, well, wait a moment, the whole world, reality is quantum, how can you, but that's just because these are caricatures, often in people's mind. They think, that's a key technology that will, will lead to huge security risks. So I think it's very important, that those who make these decisions are informed, that the scientific community plays a certain role. But as I said, there's this balance, you also don't want to be naive. And clearly, our technologies are becoming more and more powerful. They become more and more influential, get more and more impact on everything. So there's more and more interest. So you have this very powerful tool. And obviously, you have to be a little bit more careful how to share it, etc. So I think it's a very important role for the scientific community. And I think one thing we should do, as I said before, we have to inform, particularly train young scientists, to be part of that conversation, be proactive, and don't leave it to other forces to do so, because if you leave it to industry, or you leave it to politics, or to intelligence or security services, they will all often try to close off, while we see the benefits of opening up. So if you're not engaged in that conversation, you don't have this kind of balanced point of view. So I think that's one of the lessons I learned, is that how important it is that you have these conversations within the scientific community. And important thing is also to determine which areas are safe to collaborate, right? Because if you create a lot of uncertainty, like, oh, there's geopolitical tension, everything can be stolen, that's a very kind of silly point of view. That's a vast caricature of how the world is. There are huge areas where it's totally fine to collaborate, where you need the data, etc. And we should also be very clear as scientists to indicate that that's totally safe to collaborate.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you so much for the discussion and your contributions. It's been very interesting. I just wanted to ask about your opinion on the impact that the current situation in the US, like the attack to science and so on, could have in Europe. Like whether you have, because there are two options. No? I could see that we could have a risk of going on the same direction, that more, I don't know, like the political level, that we could try to copy and follow some of the things that are already happening there, or maybe the other way around, like maybe there's a counter reaction in terms of policies of defending more and more science. So I was curious whether you have already witnessed any pressure on going one direction or another in Europe.
Can I say something about it? Yeah. So I think you're already pointing out some of the important ingredients. So one thing I think is that often these political forces that you see in the US, they are also operating in Europe, perhaps less pronounced. So it's very good to take notice and see what you can do to prevent situations like that. And in fact, in some way, perhaps, it can be a positive force, because, people see the negative impact. We saw that a little bit with Brexit. I think, the big mess that was created by Brexit stopped the discussion of an exit of the European Union in many other countries, because you see an act of self-destruction and you feel, well, no, I shouldn't go in that direction. So failed experiment is also important. So perhaps this could be a positive thing. But I don't think we should underestimate that the damage that is currently in the US, and nobody knows what the final situation will be. Budgets are still being negotiated, etc. But of course, the US always has been a tremendous service to European scientists. I think many of us have spent time there. If you go to a big US university, you find people from all over the world. So the US has been playing a very important role also in supporting the global scientific enterprise. And so if things go wrong there, we all suffer. So I think actually, it's a very important moment also for Europe, for instance, to stand up and do more. If only to compensate, for there will be just lack of postdoc positions, etc. So, there has been some initiatives in Europe to attract, say, top talent out of the US. I find this a little bit sometimes discomfortable. I think it's more important that if there's just, might be temporary, but if there's a lack of positions for young people, that, Europe's to step up and create more positions, so that, this will not be, that a whole generation might get lost. I think there's a serious risk for that. And if international collaborations are undercut, then other countries should step up their efforts. So I think in general, if one country is not going in the right direction, I think we all suffer, because it's one global community. But I think it should be something that should be an argument for other countries to do a little bit more. And as you said, also make sure that this crazy dynamics, which partly I think very special to the United States. It's a very volatile country. We'll have the best and the worst, and often, very often next to each other, both in time and space. But it's clearly something that you see at least the kernels of it also in European countries. And like in the Netherlands, there's some political parties that are really echoing the same kind of crazy stuff. Setting the consensus on climate as a way as activism. It's in some sense the same playbook. So yes, I think this is something that you should observe and learn lessons from.
Yeah, I couldn't help thinking about an initiative that the Commission via the ERC took to introduce specific grants to attract researchers from the United States to Europe. The thing is that they doubled the size of the grant in order to attract US, let's say researchers who are used to a bigger paycheck. And we have just said, yeah, Europe is fantastic in science. There's a bit of a parallel. Why do we need those people? By the way, they're getting paid twice as much as we do. And so there's a lot of competition in the ERC for grants. So you have to be my point is you have to be very careful how you do it. I give no judgment, let's say, of this. I refrain from that. But it is something that, of course, the other way around, we've always pointed at. At the time, Niels Bohr and Einstein and Oppenheimer, and they went to the United States, but they went there for other reasons. So I'm a little bit skeptical about, and to what extent what we could do. In any case, you can join COST. It's open to the world, Come over here. And by the way, if you don't know anyone, join the COST network. You have many friends, in no time. So thanks.
You have any?
No, of course, this is extremely important. And I think that what we are suffering from is when you have this very extreme movement, but it has been going on for some time, is that when you are exposed to it, it becomes normalized. And we see also in places where we believe that we are safe from it, that there is political movement to interfere with academic freedom or the freedom of universities. And it again goes back to the question that we from the public, we see that universities are very important in designing our society and helping and so on. But that means that it can also work for implementing things that we don't want actually to be implemented. So we have migration and this north-south and so on. You can start emphasizing differences and why not to integrate and so on. And we see that even in a country like this, where they come directions from leading posts that we should start looking at these things. And this is very worrying because this openness and we were talking about inclusion and making it possible for everyone to enter science. I think in small countries like Sweden, when you have a very small recruitment pool, let's say to the technical universities. So I'm a professor at Chalmers when I'm not here. There one realized that there was a very small part of Gothenburg, which is a city of 500,000, where the recruitment to a whole technical university was made. There was no inclusion of people of non-Swedish background, females, people without glasses, and so on. There was a lot of exclusion. So it meant that we tried to make drive excellence, explore science with a fraction of the potential of the area. And if this is not mismanagement, what is? So it's extremely important. And if there are movements in society that want us to narrow down and exclude and so on, I think it's extremely important to engage, as you say, and perhaps almost make a new civil movement on this. And this becomes this was more in the 60s, but then, society was on an extreme upturn, right? Everything was people were going all over the world, helping developing countries turns out that Niels and I have been in developing countries as young, where our parents, who were the children of just the post-war generation, they were going all over. They were following Kennedy's moves and so on, that they were really engaging in making the world better. But now it has turned, and now we're closing in, and we have to really be aware that we don't get, it cannot become normalized to think in these ways. And it's really scary with the US, because attacking full front what is so important for democracy and well-being for mankind is really sad.
Okay. On that note,
Okay.
the time is up.
You can start singing to cheer up people. Yeah.
I think, yeah, it has been a fantastic debate. We have really been all over some really important subjects. I think there are plenty of take-home messages for everybody in this room, young, old, coming from any direction. I'm really sorry for some of the people who still had topics, but yeah, we have reached the end time of this event. But I really want to thank the three eminent speakers here for their input and the very enlightening and thought-provoking debate. So I'll give them a big hand.